Let me be straight with you right now. If SpaceX actually comes public at the kind of valuation the market is talking about, the biggest trade may not be SpaceX itself. Because most retail investors may never get access to the best SpaceX private shares, and even if an IPO happens, the most attractive allocation may go to institutions first. That means the obvious trade could be locked behind private markets. The real opportunity may be one layer deeper. Before we break down the 3 public stocks that could benefit from a SpaceX IPO repricing, subscribe to Stock Breakout, hit the like button, and drop a comment with the one space stock you think Wall Street is still underestimating. Because if this theme really starts moving, the watch list matters before the crowd shows up. Now, let's talk about what may be one of the biggest second-order trades in the market. SpaceX is not just another private company. SpaceX has become the psychological anchor for the entire commercial space economy. Rockets, satellites, Starlink, global internet, defense contracts, launch infrastructure, direct-to-cell ambitions. This is not just a rocket story anymore. This is a public market repricing story. And some market speculation points to a possible 2026 listing window, with investors watching whether SpaceX has reportedly explored confidential IPO preparations. There's also been speculation around a possible June to September timeline and some very aggressive valuation scenarios in the $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion range. None of that should be treated as confirmed, but the fact that the market is even discussing numbers that large tells you something important. Investors are no longer looking at commercial space as a science project. They're starting to look at it as infrastructure, and that is where the opportunity gets interesting. Every major technology cycle has an anchor moment. The iPhone did not just reprice Apple. It changed how investors looked at mobile chips, app platforms, carriers, component suppliers, cloud services, and digital advertising. NVIDIA did not just reprice itself. It forced Wall Street to rethink AI infrastructure, data centers, power demand, networking, memory, and software. SpaceX could potentially play a similar role for the commercial space economy. Not because every space stock is the next SpaceX. That is not the point. The point is that when the category leader receives a massive public market valuation, investors start asking a new question. What else belongs in that category? What else should be compared against it? What else has been ignored because the market did not have a clean benchmark? That is where proxy plays come in. The obvious trade is SpaceX. The second-order trade is the group of public companies that may benefit if SpaceX becomes the valuation benchmark. And for retail investors, that second-order trade may be the only trade they can actually access. If SpaceX and Starlink are valued as critical infrastructure platforms, then the market may start looking differently at launch companies, satellite manufacturers, satellite operators, direct-to-cell providers, and spectrum holders. That does not mean every stock in the group goes up. It does not mean fundamentals stop matching. It does not mean you buy hype without doing research. But it does mean the sector could move from ignored, speculative, and niche into a new public market conversation. And the 3 names I think investors will watch most closely are Rocket Lab, ticker RKLB, AST SpaceMobile, ticker ASTS, and EchoStar, ticker SATS. These are not the same trade. They are 3 different ways to express the same theme. RKLB is the launch and space systems proxy. ASTS is the direct-to-cell satellite connectivity proxy. SATS is the spectrum and satellite communications proxy. Let's start with Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab is not SpaceX, but in the public market, it may be the closest thing investors can actually buy. Rocket Lab has a launch business, a space systems business, satellite components, spacecraft manufacturing, and a long-term ambition to move into larger launch vehicles with Neutron. That matters because if SpaceX enters the market at a massive valuation, investors may immediately search for the closest public comparison. And Rocket Lab is likely to be on that list. The market already understands rockets. It understands launches. It understands the idea that lower-cost access to space can unlock new business models. But what the market may still be underpricing is that Rocket Lab is not only a launch company. Its space systems segment matters. Satellite manufacturing matters. Components matter. Mission services matter. The more the space economy expands, the more investors may care about the companies building the infrastructure behind that expansion. That is the key. If SpaceX IPO disclosures show strong launch economics, strong Starlink growth, or strong demand for space-based infrastructure, investors may become more willing to assign higher multiples to companies that sit in the same ecosystem. For RKLB, Neutron is the big swing factor. If Neutron works, Rocket Lab becomes more than a small launch provider. It becomes a more credible competitor in medium-lift launch. That could make the comparison to SpaceX more serious, even if SpaceX remains far larger and far more advanced. But this is also where the risk comes in. Rocket Lab has execution risk. Neutron has timeline risk. Launch economics are difficult. Competition is intense. Valuation can get stretched quickly when the narrative gets hot. So RKLB is not a low-risk name. But if the market starts hunting for the cleanest public SpaceX proxy, Rocket Lab may be the first place many investors look. Now, let's move to AST SpaceMobile. ASTS is not trying to be another rocket company. It is trying to turn ordinary phones into satellite-connected devices. That is a completely different angle. The core idea is simple but powerful. Instead of needing a special satellite phone, AST SpaceMobile wants regular smartphones to connect directly to satellites when terrestrial networks are unavailable or limited. That matters because the addressable market could be huge. There are billions of phones in the world. There are large coverage gaps. There are rural areas, emergency situations, maritime use cases, remote work use cases, defense use cases, and global connectivity needs. This is why direct-to-cell satellite connectivity has become one of the most exciting parts of the space communication story. And it is also why SpaceX matters. Starlink is moving into direct-to-cell. If SpaceX disclosures eventually show strong economics around Starlink, satellite connectivity, or direct-to-device services, that could become a powerful valuation anchor for ASTS. Not because ASTS is the same company. It is not. But because Wall Street may start valuing the category differently. ASTS also has something investors pay attention to: telecom partnerships. The company has relationships with major telecom players such as AT&T and Verizon, and that gives the story more credibility than a pure concept stock. When large telecom companies are involved, the market starts thinking about distribution, spectrum coordination, commercial deployment, and customer access. That is what makes ASTS so interesting. The upside narrative is very easy to understand. If satellite-to-smartphone connectivity becomes a real commercial category, ASTS could become one of the most important public names tied to that theme. But this is also one of the highest-risk names on the list. ASTS needs execution. It needs satellite deployment. It may need funding. It faces regulatory complexity. The business model still has to prove itself at scale. And the stock can be extremely sensitive to momentum, dilution fears, launch updates, and market expectations. So ASTS may be the most exciting upside story, but it is also highly volatile. This is not a sleepy infrastructure stock. This is a speculative growth stock tied to a major technology promise. Now let's talk about EchoStar, ticker SATS. SATS is the least obvious name on this list, but sometimes the least obvious proxy is where investors look when spectrum becomes the scarce asset. EchoStar is not a clean rocket company. It is not a pure direct-to-cell growth story like ASTS. It is more complicated. It is tied to satellite communications, wireless infrastructure, and valuable spectrum assets. And in a world where space-based communications become more important, spectrum can become strategically valuable. That is the key to understanding SATS. Spectrum is not flashy. It does not give you the same clean story as rockets landing or satellites connecting to smartphones. But spectrum is a critical resource. Wireless networks need it. Satellite communications need coordination around it. And when markets start thinking about communications infrastructure, spectrum holders can attract attention. That is why SATS may act more like an asset-backed satellite communications proxy than a pure space growth stock. It may not trade purely on launch excitement. It may not trade purely on Starlink comparisons. But it could become a sentiment indicator for whether investors are starting to value satellite communications assets more aggressively. The market may look at SATS and ask a different question. If space communications become more strategic, what are the spectrum assets worth? If direct-to-cell becomes a bigger category, who owns valuable pieces of the communication stack? If the sector re-rates, do asset-heavy companies get another look? That is the SATS setup. But the risks are serious. The business is complex. The balance sheet matters. Debt matters. Regulatory issues matter. The growth profile may not be as clean as RKLB or ASTS. And because SATS is not the most direct SpaceX proxy, it may not get the same narrative premium if the market only wants clean, simple stories. So SATS is interesting, but it is not simple. Now let's compare the three. RKLB is the most direct public SpaceX proxy. It is best for investors who want exposure to launch, space systems, satellite manufacturing, and commercial space infrastructure. If Wall Street starts looking for the closest public comparison to SpaceX, RKLB may be the cleanest name. ASTS is the most exciting direct-to-cell growth story. It is best for investors who want exposure to satellite-to-smartphone connectivity. If Starlink helps validate the economics of satellite communications, ASTS could become a major beneficiary of that narrative. But ASTS also carries major execution risk. SATS is the asset-heavy spectrum and satellite communications proxy. It is best for investors who are thinking less about rockets and more about strategic communications infrastructure. It may be less exciting, but spectrum can matter when the market starts repricing connectivity assets. These are not equal-risk stocks. RKLB and ASTS are likely to be higher growth and higher volatility names. SATS is more complex and more asset-driven, and that is why the ranking matters. Before I give you my ranking, we need to talk about risk. Because the SpaceX IPO trade can sound exciting, but there are a lot of ways this can go wrong. SpaceX may not IPO in the expected window. The valuation may be lower than market speculation. The reported timeline may change. The market may not accept the most aggressive valuation scenarios. And if SpaceX ever releases detailed disclosures, those numbers could help the sector or they could hurt it. If margins disappoint, if growth is not as strong as expected, or if investors question the economics, the entire proxy trade could get hit. Proxy stocks can rise on hype and fall hard when expectations reset. RKLB has execution and launch risk. ASTS has funding, deployment, and regulatory risk. SATS has balance sheet, debt, and business complexity risk. A watch list is not the same thing as a buy signal. Position sizing matters. Risk management matters. And nothing in this video is financial advice. I'm not your financial advisor. This is market commentary and research for education. Now, here's how I would rank the three based on risk-reward, narrative strength, and connection to the possible SpaceX IPO spillover. At number 3, I have SATS. Not because the asset story is irrelevant. It is relevant. Spectrum could become more valuable if satellite communications and direct-to-cell connectivity become bigger market themes. But SATS is more complex, more balance sheet sensitive, and less directly connected to the SpaceX IPO narrative. It may work as a sentiment indicator, but it is not the cleanest proxy. And number 2, I have ASTS. This may be the most exciting upside story on the list. Direct-to-cell satellite connectivity could become a massive category if it works at scale. The telecom partnerships matter. The Starlink comparison matters. And if SpaceX disclosures make investors more confident in satellite connectivity economics, ASTS could get a major narrative boost. But the execution risk is high. The volatility is high. And the market will punish delays, funding concerns, or unrealistic expectations. So ASTS has big upside potential, but it also requires a strong stomach. At number 1, I have RKLB. Not because it is another SpaceX. It is not. SpaceX is far larger, more advanced, and more dominant. But RKLB may be the cleanest public market proxy for investors who want exposure to the commercial space infrastructure trade. It connects to launch. It connects to satellites. It connects to space systems. It connects to the idea that access to space is becoming a real economy, not just a government program or a private market fantasy. If SpaceX becomes the benchmark, Rocket Lab may become the public comparison investors can actually buy. That is why RKLB takes the top spot for me. The real story behind a potential SpaceX IPO is not just SpaceX itself. The real story may be whether SpaceX forces Wall Street to reprice the entire commercial space economy. Rockets, satellites, direct-to-cell connectivity, spectrum, space communications, infrastructure. The obvious trade may be private. The second-order trade is public. And that is why RKLB, ASTS, and SATS deserve a spot on the watch list. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to Stock Breakout, hit the like button, and comment below with the stock you would rank number 1. Would you choose RKLB, ASTS, or SATS? Because if SpaceX really becomes the new valuation anchor for commercial space, the question is not just whether SpaceX goes public. The real question is what gets repriced around it.